Welcome to our class. We're really pleased you've come. We're just about to finish Matthew's Gospel, about 4 more chapters here, and we'll move along fairly quickly, but not rush past. And then I'm eager to get on to Mark's Gospel. I'm always eager to finish one and get on to the next one. I'm eager to share with you some of the insights of a woman professor. I told you I try to give you a variety. All of them, of course, I look for the very best scholarship that I can find. So it's not a downgrade as I move from one to the other. Not by any means. It simply is a different perspective. And so this time we've been dealing with one of America's best-known scholars on the Gospel of Matthew. When the Methodist Church was redoing a big series of commentaries that they had first come out with back in the 1950s, and 50 years later they decided, well, we need to do that again. They chose Dr. Eugene Boring to write the commentary on Matthew. He is a disciple of Christ at TCU, the School of Divinity there, which is called Brite, B-R-I-T-E, Brite Divinity School. But when we get to Mark, we're going to shift to a woman, and not only that, but a woman Roman Catholic from Boston College. And I think Dr. Femi Perkins is really capable. I've read other things that she's done, but she sort of poured her adult lifetime into the Gospel of Mark. And so I think you will be blessed by her very faithful work and her helpful insights. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us today. If you're new with us, please do come again. We're always glad to have new people join us, visitors, even if you're here for just a day on your vacation or something. We're glad you've come. If you haven't been to church yet, let me encourage you to stay. Our choir is going to be doing John Rutter's arrangement of Shall We Gather at the River. You know, it's funny. Musicians are funny. We had a minister of music down in Houston years ago that would not do July Revival. He just said July Revival was beneath him. He didn't do this stuff. It wasn't of a quality music and so on. We got a new hymn book back in 1969. Now this was a long time ago, as you can tell. I went to this particular church in 1967, and so I'd been there a couple of years when we got the new 1969 hymn book. And in this hymn book, this is when we became United Methodist, was in 1968. We actually absorbed into a much bigger body, the Evangelical United Brethren, and we were trying to reach out to our strong mission work, particularly in the continent of Africa, but in South America, Central America, and so on. Anyway, that hymn book of 1969 had folk music of Africa and Guatemala and so on. And our minister of music, every Sunday night, I had asked him, I was the Sunday night preacher, will you lead us in 20 minutes of hymnody? Because he loved to tell you, and Charles Wesley wrote this one afternoon when he'd eaten 2 green apples he picked off a tree and his stomach was a little upset, and that was kind of stuff he liked to tell. So he was wonderful, and he kept people interested in what we were singing. So he would do about 20 minutes of hymnody every Sunday evening, and Dr. Allen would say the evening prayer, would take up the money, and then I would preach. And when we got this new hymn book, he was teaching us just every Sunday night. Now let's do one of the folk songs from South Africa. Let's do one of the folk songs from Zimbabwe. Let's do one of the folk songs from Guatemala. And one Sunday night, as he and Dr. Charles Allen and I were walking out to the parking lot to get in our cars afterward, Dr. Allen looked at him and said, Roger, you're trying to teach us the folk music of South Africa and the folk music of Zimbabwe and Guatemala and so on. Yes. Dr. Allen, I think we should, take this music that comes right from the people's heart. And Dr. Allen said, Roger, what we sing in July is the folk music of the old Bible Belt South. And a light came on for him. It did. He thought about that, and a few days later he said to Dr. Allen, I'll do July this year. And he did it happily ever after. Well, we had a director of music here a few years ago who had come out of a Nazarene background, but he had come as far from that as he could, and he didn't want to do July Revival particularly. But when John Rutter of Cambridge University did an arrangement of Shall We Gather at the River, suddenly it was okay. You call it Beautiful River and it's okay. So anyway, ever since then, for almost 25 years, we've had Shall We Gather at the River, called Beautiful River in the John Rudder arrangement. So if you haven't been to church, it's worth staying for church just to hear what our choir does with that. It's wonderfully done. Okay, let's pray. God, we open now your book with some trepidation. We understand quite easily parts of it, and other parts of it are difficult for us. So we ask your help. We're grateful for people like Dr. Boring who help us, but we still count on you to help us enlighten us, help us find those things that are forever true and apply them to the living of our lives, individually and collectively as Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, we're at Thursday night. Jesus has just been arrested and is being taken now to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Those of you who have been to Israel with us went to the house that they say may well have been the house of Caiaphas, and there's a number of reasons why they think it may have been. One of them is that there is a big round room down underneath the main part of the house that had a tiny little opening up at the top. And they believe that a person could be lowered down through the opening and then couldn't get out until one's hoisted out. The sides were all curved, and there's one little opening right up at the top, sort of like being in a round bottle, and that you couldn't get out without somebody helping you. And they think that Jesus was perhaps lowered through that little hole and made to stay downstairs there while his fate was debated upstairs. Now, no one can prove that this was the house of Caiaphas. I find some people are more interested in the steps leading up to Caiaphas' house. It's on the side of a hill there. It's just on the south edge of the old wall part of the city. And those steps are things they can date, and carbon dating, etc. And they say these are steps from more than 2,000 years ago. And that Jesus was probably, if you look where the olive trees are, where the Gethsemane, the olive press was, and so on, that this is probably the very steps that he was led up that night for the trial. So you can see some things that we can say, pretty sure this is the real stuff here, and this may be real stuff. Okay, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priest and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, 'I'm going to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes. That's what you do in ancient times when you are undone by some horrible news, death of someone you really love. You tear your clothes to show that you're undone here. So the high priest tears his clothes and said, "He is blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." See, we know folks from Boston don't sound like folks from Birmingham, Alabama. That's all they're saying. He doesn't sound like he lives around here. He sounds like those folks that live up by the Sea of Galilee, Caesarea, at Tiberias. Anyway, Certainly you're also one of us, also one of them, your accent betrays you. Then he began to curse and swore an oath, I do not know the man. And at that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Let's go on. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. Okay, now let's turn to Dr. Boring. This entire scene we've just read takes place at one location, the house of Caiaphas the high priest. Matthew's account intensifies Mark's view that the Jewish leaders were the major culprits in the arrest and execution of Jesus. Now, just remember quickly, we won't belabor this time, but our best scholars believe that Matthew has in front of him the scroll of Mark, and I can show you more of that when we get on into Mark's Gospel. He has in front of him some source of teachings about Jesus. He and Luke agree on whole paragraphs without varying even one word on some of the stories of Jesus. And we don't have this, but the German scholars several centuries ago started calling it the Quelle, or the source of the teachings. And then he had in front of him the Hebrew Bible that had been translated into Greek, because more of them could read, write, and understand Greek than could read, write, and understand Hebrew. And that translation into Greek was called the Septuagint. So here when Dr. Boring says Matthew's account intensifies Mark's account, it means he adds more stuff to it, that these were the leaders of the Jews who were seeing to his death. The scene of Peter seated among the temple guards is introduced here. Matthew adds false before the word testimony. That's interesting. If you want to look at that, Mark chapter 14, verse 55 says we need testimony. Matthew intensifies, adds the word false that Mark doesn't have, to emphasize the hypocrisy of the Jewish authorities, because as Matthew's been telling you and me for chapters now, they've already decided to kill him. They're just looking for an excuse, a pretext. In Mark, you feel that the chief priests are looking for authentic testimony and find false witnesses. In Matthew, they look for false witnesses and end up with the truth. For Matthew, Jesus is able to destroy the temple, something he does not in fact do, of course, but Matthew believes he could have. And Jesus is silent in the face of his accusers. The high priest infers that Jesus does indeed claim to operate with power that belongs only to God, and that such a claim is blasphemous. He places Jesus under oath and charges him with claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus' response in Matthew is a clear affirmative of that. Meanwhile, Peter voluntarily denies with an oath. They don't put him under oath. He swears by God himself that he doesn't know him, never was one of his. Jesus affirms that he is the Christ, the Son of God, but shifts to the title he's used all along, Son of Man. Jesus' self-identification as Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man, is considered blasphemous by the religious leaders. So Jesus is found guilty of a capital offense. The garments of the high priest were very sacred, such a sacred sign of authority that the Romans often locked them up in a sort of a garment, chaperon, if you would, robe that they kept the key to. Because if the high priest couldn't put on his robes, then he didn't have the same authority. We do the same thing in the Methodist Church. Here at Boston Avenue, we're very faithful about robing up. If I'm going to baptize one person, I robe. If we're going to marry just a couple with two witnesses, I put on my robe. If we're doing a funeral here and so on, we put on our robe. If someone's already died and we've had the memorial service, and then a few days later the cremains are ready to be placed in the columbarium, I go to the sacristy and put on my robe. It's a sign of my ordination, when the bishop put his hands on my head and said, "Take thou authority to administer the sacraments, to preach the gospel, and to maintain order within the body of Christ," and so on. So the robes were even more significant in those days. And the high priest, when he tears his clothes, that's significant. Tearing them is explicitly forbidden in the book of Leviticus, one of the Torah scrolls. So, Is Matthew picturing the high priest as violating the Torah in the very act of condemning Jesus? The high priest and elders are portrayed as spitting on Jesus and striking him. But Jesus continues to live out his teachings of non-retaliation. The scene concludes by switching back to Peter in the courtyard of the house. The charge is being with Jesus. Matthew varies the Markan sequence. Again, if you look at this in a parallel, you can see how Mark has the questions raised to Peter and his responses, and Matthew changes the order. And when they do that, when you know he's looking at Mark, because we can see where he's just been copying him, and suddenly varies it, it's almost always for a reason. Matthew understands the story could be told a little more effectively another way. Now, as one who tries to tell stories well, I can understand that. Some years ago when Kevin Tully was still with us, Kevin was our minister of evangelism, and so he was the one who came forward at the closing hymn to help me identify anyone who was coming forward to join the church. And Kevin was the one we sent to the burning bush to answer people's questions and so on. So that Easter Sunday, Kevin slipped into the sanctuary after each of the 3 services. He was there for all 3 of them. And my closing story, I thought was a really good story, but I told it at 8 o'clock and I didn't think I had it. I mean, there's a way to say things, a way to phrase that last couple of sentences, and I wasn't happy with it. And so at the 9:30 service on Easter Sunday, I rearranged just the ending. I don't mean the outcome, just the way I was saying it. I rearranged the way I was saying it. And I didn't feel it happened the way I wanted it to, that it could. And so I agonized over it, and at 11 o'clock I changed it again, just a little bit. And when the service was over and we were walking out and the choir was singing the Alleluia chorus, Kevin turned to me and said, "If it makes any difference, I think you got it right." And he had noticed, you see, that I changed it just a little each time to try to get it right. So that's what Matthew is doing. Mark didn't get that just right. If you told it this way, it would be a little more effective. So that's what good storytellers do. Those of us who struggle along are impressed with those who do it wonderfully well. Okay, Matthew varies the Markan sequence so that the 3 challenges are first a servant girl, a second servant girl, and then bystanders. Just as Matthew has added 2 witnesses to the trial in which Jesus confesses the Christian truth, he is the Messiah, so also Matthew has 2 witnesses for Peter's denial of that same truth. Remember, in Judaism you need 2 witnesses, one supporting the other to bring charge. There is no doubt that Peter denied that he was a disciple during Jesus' trial. It is very likely that anyone would have invented such a story as prominently as Peter figured in the history of the early church. He really did it. That's the point. Whereas Jesus was strengthened for the coming test by praying 3 times out there in that olive grove earlier in the evening, whereas Jesus had stood firm to his confession 3 times, Peter denies in each of his 3 confrontations. Peter adds to his oath a curse. Now, the word curse is used only here in the whole New Testament, suggesting that Peter cursed Jesus, his friendship, his relationship with Jesus. Matthew has rewritten Mark's ambiguous closing line to make it clear that Peter is sorry, that he repents, and will be reinstated as a good disciple. Mark sort of leaves you hanging, just as he does about the resurrection. When we get to the Markan story, you remember Mark says the women came, found the stone rolled away, and they walked away and told no one. Period. Okay, so Mark tells it differently. Matthew tells it differently from Mark. So here, where Mark just sort of leaves you hanging about what happened to Peter after the denials, Matthew wants his readers to know Peter was really sorry. And when one is really sorry, there is a chance for a new beginning. In the Matthean story, the trial and mocking last throughout the night. The rooster is already crowing and it's still going on. Okay, let's read one more verse here, just verse 2. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Now, again, those of you who've been to Jerusalem, and I hope the rest of you can go someday. I've just been afraid to try to take you. I've told you that when some of you were going with us, we were fortunate to get to go 5 times. Both sides, Palestinians and Jews, were not picking on Americans. They both understood that they needed American tourist dollars. But a few years ago, they started blowing up pizza parlors and ice cream stands and things where tourists were. When I was with you, often one of the nights we were in Jerusalem, I would suggest, if we were at a hotel close enough, let's walk over to Behuda Street where they have ice cream and pastry shops and things, and let's just walk and stroll. And it was a wonderful place to go at night. I simply was afraid that I could not take you safely. And maybe there will be a time when we can again. But those of you who have been will recall when we went to the model of the ancient city. Remember that? It's probably a third of an acre, maybe, isn't it? Maybe a third of an acre that they have reconstructed Jerusalem of Jesus' time. Now, it was done by Jews, so they don't call it Jerusalem of Jesus' time. It was the Jerusalem of Herod the Great's time. But that's when Jesus was born, of course. And so every time archaeologists find that there's any mistake in that model, they change it. I mean, when they dig down and they find that there wasn't a walkway there wasn't a door there, or whatever, if they find any reference at all to the fact that they've made a mistake, they change it. And so it's gradually updated. But what I'm trying to remind you is that in ancient Jerusalem, as in all modern cities, there were neighborhoods for the wealthy, for the powerful. You can see their houses are bigger, they're finer. As you get into other areas, and it has to do with the way the wind blows and so on. Prevailing winds. You don't want to be downwind of the stockyards. You don't want to be downwind of where the animals are slaughtered, or the sheep market and so on. So, same in biblical times. The poor people lived downwind of the bad smells and so on, and the people who had more money lived upwind where they didn't have to smell those things and so on. The palace, the fortress, was very close to the Temple Mount. And though the Roman person in charge, there's debate as to what was the proper title for him. It's called governor here by Matthew. Pilate the governor came over to Jerusalem when these big holy days came, just to be sure that he had control of the military and that he could send them to action if they needed to be, if there was any kind of insurrection. So Pilate is in town, and it's not a long walk. It's not far from the house of Caiaphas, right over to the Antonius Palace there. Okay. This verse transfers the action now to Pilate's court. The historical situation is disputed with regard to the measure of local autonomy the Roman authorities permitted the Jewish leaders. Not all agree that they had much to say about anything. More believe that Pilate ruled with an iron fist. Pilate, as Roman governor, represented the real political power. Jewish leaders were allowed to carry on their religious observances and so on, as long as they didn't threaten anything Roman. The Jews have the authority to condemn other Jews, including Jesus, but Pilate would have to be the one to carry out the execution, as Matthew understood it. Let's go on, verse 3. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders. Remind you, Mark doesn't tell you how much silver. Matthew tells you it was 30 pieces, which was the going price for a slave that was injured or crippled. I mean, it's to emphasize even more how little Jesus was thought of by those who are willing to pay. Judas got a pittance, a nothing, for handing Jesus over, is what's being said here. Judas said, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, meaning Judas, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Now Matthew is writing probably about 85, the year 85. So it's already been 55 years or so since the death and resurrection of Jesus. And he's saying 55 years later, they still call this place by that name. It's been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And here he's got his Septuagint right in front of him, Matthew does, and he writes, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me." So Matthew finds in his Holy Writ an explanation for what he's just told you happened at the time of Jesus' arrest and now being taken to Pilate. Okay, let's get a little bit more from Dr. Boring before we go on. Matthew's Gospel is the only one of the four to continue the story of Judas after the scene of Jesus' arrest in Gethsemane. The other three all drop Judas right there at the moment Jesus is betrayed. Matthew gives you this little follow-up. Having realized that he had made a great mistake, Judas seems to have done all the right things that could be done at that point. He is sorry. He returns the money. He acknowledges Jesus' innocence and his own guilt. Yet Matthew seems to hold him up as a model of failed discipleship, one who would have been better off if he had not been born. And Matthew has told you that those who follow Jesus and then turn away from him, it would have been better for them if they hadn't been born. Here is such an example, Judas. Matthew has developed the story in terms of the biblical story of David. Remember, it's so important that he sees Jesus like David, but greater, like Moses, but greater. Matthew has developed the story in terms of the biblical story of David, whose kingdom was threatened by an opposing kingdom and who had a friend who betrayed him and then hanged himself. If you want to read that, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 17. The verb hanged occurs only these 2 times in the Bible. Meaning what? Matthew opened his Bible. It wasn't a book, unrolled if you would. He looked. And here he takes a word that is found only one time in all of the Hebrew Scriptures. In all of the 39 scrolls, it's found one time in that reference to a friend of David who betrayed David into the hands of an enemy and then saw what he had done and hanged himself. And he chose that same verb to describe what Judas does to himself, and otherwise the word is not used any other place in the Bible. Once in the Hebrew Scriptures, once in the Christian. It's obvious to scholars that Matthew is looking up things out of the Septuagint, looking up things and seeing and trying to help his readers understand that Jesus is continuation of God's story. What's happened before is happening again, but this time to God's own Son, greater than David. Unlike Peter, Judas does not return to the community of disciples. He dies in private despair. The high priests in Matthew are represented as uniformly evil. Just as they had decided in advance to kill Jesus and sought false witnesses, they had only used Judas and now have no more use for him. They didn't care for him. He was just a pawn. The priests consider the money paid to Judas to be unclean, justly acknowledging their own guilt as well. It's blood money. They officially decide to use the money to purchase the potter's field, which became known to those as the field of blood because it was bought with blood money. Money taken by Judas in exchange for Jesus' life. Let's go on. Verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. Now notice that the three letters B-A-R on the first part of his second name, as it's written for us in English, was a word itself, as the Germans have used V-O-N. So-and-so von Franken, if you would. It's from the house of or the family of. And so they're going to have a choice between Jesus, son of Mary, and Joseph. Jesus, son of Bar-Abbas. And who is Abbas? Father. Son of his father. Let's go on. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Messiah?" For he realized it was out of jealousy that Now the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to him, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Now you can see that we need to deal with a passage like this very carefully, because it's been used against Jews for 2,000 years. You saw what happened in Seattle this past week. A Muslim forced his way through the door of a Jewish federation and started shooting old women. 1 dead, 3 critically ill, life support systems was the latest I heard. Did you hear about your friend Mel Gibson? Okay, Mel Gibson was accused 2 years ago of making an anti-Semitic film, The Passion of Christ. It was made public at that time that his own father had said to as many as would listen that the Holocaust never happened. It was made up by Jewish propagandists. Mel Gibson was arrested DWI 2 nights ago at 2:30 in the morning, and now the police officers have told what he was screaming at them, that they must be Jews. All wars in the world have been begun by Jews. Mel Gibson said he was not anti-Semitic. When he was drunk, it all spewed out of his mouth. He also said, "I've been an alcoholic all of my adult life. I've sometimes battled it more successfully than others." The Jews have a hard time, and you and I don't need to add to their hard times. So let's listen very carefully to what Dr. Boring has to say, and then as I go through this with you again, we'll see if I think anything else needs to be added. In this scene, Matthew follows Mark closely. And again, I have a parallel in Greek, and you can see here that, just every word, he and Mark are right together here. After the story of Judas' death, told only by Matthew, Matthew adds a sentence to bring the storyline back to Jesus' trial. Otherwise, he's copying right from Mark's manuscript. Pilate's question is clearly a political charge. Is this man committing treason? If so, that would be a capital offense. Jesus confesses his identity. These are Jesus' only words in the Roman trial. He will speak only once more before his death in Matthew's Gospel, just one more time. We talk about the 7 words from the cross. But no one Gospel writer has all 7. You have to pull them from all 4 to come up with 7. Matthew has just 1. We'll get to that. Matthew adopts the Markan picture, that's simply the way Mark told it, of the annual custom of releasing one prisoner at the festival. This practice is not documented outside the New Testament. Jews deny that it ever happened. They say Pilate never released a Jewish prisoner every year, and no one has ever found any other reference to it except in the New Testament. He just wants you to know that this practice is not documented outside the New Testament and is omitted by Luke, who wrote later yet. Luke doesn't have that part about, I always release somebody to you. And Luke, Dr. Boring believes, is more sophisticated in Gentile Roman matters. Okay, in the Gospels, the episode has the effect of heightening the contrast between Jesus' true identity as the one who saves His people and who is the true Son of the Father, and Barabbas, which simply means Jesus, Son of His Father. So you've got Jesus, Son of His Father, and Jesus, Son of the eternal, heavenly Father, who saves His people from their sins, the true Son of the Father. So once again, Matthew makes it very clear you have two kingdoms standing over against each other, and everybody has to choose. This Jesus? This Jesus. The Jewish leaders will persuade the people to choose a notorious criminal, according to Matthew. Now, verse 19 may be taken as increasing Pilate's guilt. That is, if he knows by divine revelation that Jesus is innocent, and he's commanded by God to have nothing to do with him. Certainly hand washing doesn't do away with it. He had full power to release Jesus and send him on his way back to Nazareth. So just washing one's hands doesn't take away all of one's responsibility. The crowds have throughout been pictured by Matthew as uncommitted. The crowds are uncommitted. The leaders of the Jews in Jerusalem are moving among the crowd, telling them that they should scream out for his death. Their first sign of opposition is their presence at the arrest of Jesus. Pilate, desiring to release Jesus, miscalculates, counting on the crowd to overrule the intent of the Jewish leaders to kill him. He thinks the great body will say, we don't want that Jesus Barabbas, release the other. But he's wrong, of course. When asked for their reasons why they want him killed, they simply turn up the volume, giving no reason, just spouting what the leaders have told them. Kill him, crucify him. Here Matthew makes his second addition to Mark's account. He makes his second addition to enhance the contrast between Jewish guilt and Roman innocence. He pictures Pilate as absolving himself of guilt and the Jewish people as fully accepting responsibility for Jesus' death. This scene is only in Matthew, and was probably composed by Matthew himself. Now you need to think about that, of course. Is this something the crowd said, or is Matthew, it's not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John, it's in Matthew. Dr. Boring thinks Matthew probably wrote this line, let his blood be on us and our children. The people respond with words accepting the guilt. These words were tragically misinterpreted by Christians of later centuries who continued to blame the Jewish people as a whole for the death of Jesus. Matthew looks back on the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Remember, Matthew's definitely writing after Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 70. And he sees this. Matthew sees it as divine punishment for rejecting the Messiah. The people in Matthew's story do not invoke guilt on all future generations, but on themselves and their children. That is, the generation that experienced the devastation of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Matthew does not pronounce a sentence on all Jews forever. Let's go on. Verse 26. So Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Meaning, again, put his own clothes back on him. The Roman trial concludes with the Gentiles mocking him as king. Gentiles, your people and mine. The mocking is preceded by the flogging, a terrible beating administered on the bare back with a leather whip, often studded with pieces of metal or bone to increase the torture. Its severity was sometimes fatal. Again, pathologists and others who witnessed Mel Gibson's film said that he had Jesus beaten so many times, he would have been dead hours before it's depicted. It was far overdone in Mel Gibson's movie. We talked about that at the time. Matthew, like the other three Gospels, avoids graphic description. He doesn't go into graphic detail, just says he was whipped. The mocking scene is given in vivid detail, however. What is being said, Jesus is indeed king, but kingship is here redefined by those who are mocking him. All the accoutrements and insignia of royalty are mockingly noted. Jesus is a clown king to them, complete with robe, crown, scepter, kneeling, acclamation, all these things one would normally do before a true king. They just don't know, they've never seen such a true king as this one. In contrast to the homage paid the true king of the Jews by the Magi, remember what those who came from the east on their camels did. They fell down on their knees before him and worshipped him and offered him the most expensive gifts they had. That's the way Matthew's gospel began. Only Matthew tells us the story of the Magi, those wise ones from the east. Wise ones fall down on their knees. These stupid Roman soldiers, he says, they mock him. They don't understand at all. So the true king receives violence at their hands rather than inflicting it himself, which is what true kings usually did. Okay, let's go on. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. Dr. Boring, let's pick up with him, because he's warning you not to miss a verse here that's not commented upon. Matthew takes this scene from Mark. The vertical crucifixion stake was fixed in the ground at the place of execution. Okay, normally the vertical member stayed in the ground. Each new person being crucified came out of the whipping and beating and so on with the cross member on his shoulders, usually already affixed to it, so to speak. Again, the vertical crucifixion stake was fixed in the ground at the place of execution. As further humiliation, the condemned prisoner was usually forced to carry the heavy crossbar himself. Matthew follows Mark. He's going right along with Mark here and picturing Jesus as not carrying his own crossbar. A passerby named Simon was requisitioned by the Romans for the task. But notice here again just one of the interesting little things when you read all the Gospels. Simon, in Matthew's account, is no longer identified as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Remember that in Mark's account? It says, they commanded one Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry the cross. What would that mean? Mark thinks his readers will know who Alexander and Rufus are. Matthew doesn't think his readers will know who Alexander and Rufus are. He leaves them out. To me, it just simply personalizes it and says these were two different men telling the story differently. Apparently, they had been known in Mark's community, but not in Matthew's. The fact that Simon is originally from Cyrene, that's in northern Africa, the modern nation of Libya. Okay. It's in Libya. Anticipates the mission to the Gentiles. Remember, Matthew's the one who's going to have the Great Commission. Go ye into all the world. It literally says go to all the ethnics, teaching, preaching, baptizing, and so on. And so Simon of Cyrene, whose sons are known to Mark's readership, meaning they must have come into the Christian community. Their father from northern Africa, modern-day Libya, is Already, Matthew is seeing this as an outreach to the Gentile community. Let's go on. In the Matthean story, the only person present at Golgotha whose name we know is an outsider. None of the disciples are there. The first 11 ran Thursday night. Peter hung around till Friday morning. Now he's disappeared as well. The only person whose name you and I know is Simon of Cyrene, is there with Jesus at the moment. That a stranger named Simon is forced to carry Jesus' cross emphasizes in Matthew's account the abandonment of Jesus' own disciples, especially the one named Simon, Peter. The one he counted on more than any other is not there. There is a Simon there, but it's not Simon Peter. It's Simon of Cyrene, who would be a Gentile, probably. Okay? One of us. And the ministry will go to the Gentiles as Matthew understands it. Okay, a little farther, verse 33. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, and Matthew's afraid his readers won't know what that means, so he tells them, place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Now over his head they put a charge against him which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Notice these words, "If you are the Son of God." And in Greek, they are identical to the words spoken by the tempter right after he was baptized in the desert all that time ago. If you are the Son of God, speak. All these little rocks out here will become loaves of bread and so on. You remember? If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priest also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to," implying God doesn't want to, for he said, "I am God's Son." The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice. And this is the only one of the 7 words that Matthew has. And here, they think he's calling Elijah because the first 2 syllables in Elijah are the first 2 syllables in the oldest name for God they had. And it is Eliha, and God's oldest name they knew was Elohim. Remember? And I've told you that I never heard this in my own mind so hauntingly as when I was with the seminary singers at SMU. Our director of the seminary singers later was director of choral music for the whole university choir, died just a couple of years ago, but he brought the SMU choir to our church about 7 or 8 years ago, Dr. Lloyd Fouch. And he had arranged a musical setting of the 7 last words. When I was in the seminary singers, it was an all-male group. It's almost 50% female now at all of our mainline seminaries, but it wasn't then. We were all young males, early 20s, right out of college. And I remember he chose a tenor that had the most beautiful, piercing voice to sing these words. And it came out similar way to you hear sounds coming from grieving women in the Middle East today. This plaintive tenor voice sang out, "Eli, Eli." It would make you shiver that Jesus was crying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" When some of the passers-by heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, "Wait, let us see whether Eliha will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice, but Matthew doesn't tell what he said, and breathed his last. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Curtain of the temple hid the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest went, and he only once a year on the day of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the New Year day, when sins are forgiven and a new year begins. Okay. The earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs also were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. And when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." You know, the word centurion comes from the same Latin word that we have in century. It means 100. A centurion was one who had 100 men under his control. He was the officer of 100. Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. Now, when I said earlier, of course, and I was reading right from Dr. Boring, that there was only one person right there beside Jesus at the moment he was crucified, whose name we know. Up to that point, that's true. Now Matthew mentions some other names, but they're not the 12. They're the women. Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They'd followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Okay, let's see what Dr. Boring says. The actual location of the crucifixion is unknown. The traditional site at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City was identified by Helena, mother of Constantine. Let's go back just a moment and remind you. When Constantine embraced Christianity, and this was 300 years after the time of Jesus, he immediately dispatched his mother, sent her to the Holy Land to search out all the most significant places in the life of Jesus and to build churches over them. And so whoever traveled with Helena said this is where he was crucified, and they built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's still there. It's been there for 1,700 years now. And every so often somebody tries once more to see if they can determine that it really is or really is not the place. Those of you who've been to Israel, at least with us on our 5 trips, know that we went to a place called Gordon's Calvary. Gordon was a British general, just a little over 100 years ago, who was stationed there. And one morning looked out of his hotel room and he saw a rock out on the horizon there that looked like a skull. And he's probably bored to death, so he said to his soldiers, go dig and see what you find. And as they started digging, they found a very elaborate system of irrigation ditches carved out of rock. They found a huge cistern that had been covered over for 1,800 years that had once stored water for irrigating in this beautiful garden. Furthermore, they found an unfinished tomb with a track for rolling a stone over it. And the Anglican Church bought the property, have replanted the gardens, and now you can go there. There's no charge. You may go. They do ask that all who come take up an offering, all the groups, but they will prepare communion for you if you have an ordained clergy person there to help you. And they have different little areas. Some of you remember, they have little areas among the greenery and so on where 5 people or 50 people, can gather and have a quiet time and communion at the garden tomb. Okay. So Dr. Boring's about to talk about that one. Gordon's Calvary, just outside the present city walls, was identified by a British general in the 19th century on the basis of the shape of the hill. But Golgotha, in Latin it's Calvaria, so we have cavalry. Both Golgotha and Calvaria mean skull. It's never called a hill in the Bible. Its location on a hill is unlikely, since crucifixions were intended to have a public message and were located by the Romans right beside the busiest public thoroughfares. Matthew follows Mark in locating the site of the execution outside the city walls. Mark had pictured Jesus being offered wine with myrrh itself a delicacy in those days, but something also used as a narcotic to ease the pain of the condemned. Matthew changes Mark's word, myrrh, to gall. Mark's helpful narcotic becomes in Matthew a cruel joke played on Jesus. Matthew has Jesus taste it and then refuse it. None of the evangelists wished to portray a drugged or unconscious Jesus on the cross, but as one who was fully aware and fully able to speak. As with the flogging, the actual crucifixion is mentioned in just one word in Matthew. They crucified him, giving you no other details. The main verb deals with dividing the garments of the condemned, expressed in words taken again from Psalm chapter 22. In earliest Christianity, Psalm 22 became a key source of imagery for portraying the passion of Christ. In this psalm, a desperately sick person laments to God that relatives are already dividing up his or her belongings. And Charles Dickens picked up on that with A Christmas Carol and shows old Scrooge being taken to his apartment by the ghost of Christmas future, showing them already dividing up his garments, believing him to be dead when Scrooge, of course, isn't dead yet. Okay. Matthew adds the detail that the soldiers sat down and watched Jesus. That's not in Mark. The deep irony of the whole trial, the mocking, the crucifixion, is concentrated on a placard placed on the cross. It was intended, too, as a crude, coarse joke. But the reader knows, you and I know, it's profoundly true. He is the King of the Jews and of all God's people everywhere, whether they know it or not. The two crucified with Jesus are described, as in Mark, as bandits, which can refer to criminals, to robbers, or can mean revolutionaries, zealots, freedom fighters. Josephus uses the same word to describe those groups. In Matthew, Jesus is not classed with revolutionaries, but with common criminals, thus increasing the humiliation. Now, while Jesus is on the cross, in Matthew, he's derided by three groups. The passers-by deride him with the charge of claiming to destroy and rebuild the temple. Their challenge for the one who saved others to save himself is not the refutation of his claims, but the very truth taught by Jesus. Second, the whole Sanhedrin is pictured as being present, as chief priests, scribes, and elders join in the taunt, this time using the very words of Psalm 22, verse 9. They challenge him to come down from the cross. And third, the robbers join in the same derision. Now, you know, in one of the Gospels, one of them says to the other, "How can you be so cruel to him? You and I deserve what's happening to us. This man does not." Matthew has none of that in his. The people crucified on either side of him challenge him to come down. There is no repentant thief in Matthew's account. Jesus suffers among criminals with no friend, no relative, no disciple, no convert present. The noon to 3 p.m. period is taken from Mark. Matthew does not adopt this schema, so this is his first reference to time. Matthew probably intends the darkness to be worldwide as he understood it. This is the first of the signs that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is a prefiguration of the parousia, the coming again when cataclysmic things occur. Jesus' only articulate word from the cross is the first line of Psalm 22. In Matthew, that's the only thing that they made out. There was another cry, but Matthew doesn't tell you what it was. The human Jesus is pictured as dying with a cry of anguish and abandonment on his lips, and yet not of despair. In the darkness and pain, he still addresses his lament to God. My God, my God. Matthew has slightly adjusted the language from Mark's Aramaic. Mark wrote Eloi, Eloi, which is Aramaic. Matthew changes it to the Greek, which is Ele, Ele. This also facilitates the bystanders' misunderstanding that Jesus is calling for Elijah or Elijah. One of the bystanders wants to offer Jesus a drink of some of the cheap wine carried by soldiers. It's soured and very cheap stuff, so it's called vinegar. And I understand, I'm not a wine drinker myself, that wine can take on the properties of vinegar if not cared for, getting too old or whatever. He's offered this in order to prolong his life a little, but others, wanting to increase his distress, forbid it in Matthew's account. The change from he expired to he yielded up his spirit reflects Matthew's view of a Jesus who dies a truly human death, but still with the lordly dignity of one who is the Son of God. They have not taken his life, he's given it to them. Now the eschatological, which means end-time signs that began with the darkness, continue as Jesus dies. The temple curtain is split from top to bottom. Matthew has in mind the veil that separates the most holy place from the rest of the temple. Ripping this curtain effectively demolishes the temple as the site of God's presence and places God's presence on that cross. The eschatological signs continue with an earthquake that splits the rocks. The tombs of Israelite saints are opened as Jesus dies. These saints are Jewish people who are brought to life by the death of Jesus. Already in the death of Jesus, the dead-raising power of God has broken in. Jesus' death and the eschatological events it triggers have a profound effect on the Gentiles nearby. The Roman execution squad is converted by seeing these events. In Mark, only the centurion says this is the Son of God. In Matthew's account, it's all the soldiers at the foot of the cross. In Matthew, they signify this by reciting in unison, truly this one was the Son of God. Matthew follows Mark in picturing certain women as viewing the crucifixion from a distance, who will be able to validate the death and burial, and who will serve as witnesses to his resurrection. Mary Magdalene is clearly identified. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, may be the mother of Jesus himself. But if so, this is a peculiar way to identify her. Mark's Salome has been replaced by the mother of James and John. The mother of the sons of Zebedee reminds the reader of the absence of Jesus' disciples. Their mother is there, but they are not there. The presence of the women is substituting for these men who are cowering in fear. These women have a key role as witnesses to the crucifixion and resurrection, and they are still present after all the male disciples have run away. Well, we got to stop. We went a little bit long.